If you follow the news closely, now needless to say that today America, politically speaking, is standing at the crossroads. And not only we're seeing this complication of the political agenda, but meanwhile, we've seen more and more people start to question this political ambition and, of course, this economic ambition under the current administration. But meanwhile, for so long that when we talk about the nation today, it's rather crucial and significant. We need to examine the history of the nation. It's really the question that we need to ask. What is the future for the country? Of course, we also need to ask, how far has this country come since the beginning? Well, if you remember our show previously, we talked about the founding fathers and we talk about their contributions to make America to become more perfect and, of course, the champion of democracy. But meanwhile, in this episode, we need to talk about another critical part regarding what we called some of the well-known, but also some of the female leaders that actually contributed to the growth and the success of America. And for example, Harriet Tubman. And how much do we remember about her contribution in terms of, again, the famous historical evidence called Underground Railroad? And also, what about this woman that she almost revolutionized the entire country? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Fields Black. Dr. Fields Black is a specialist in the transnational history of West African rice farmers and peasant farmers in pre-colonial Upper Guinea coast and enslaved laborers on rice plantations in the South Carolina and Georgia. And of course, if you're familiar with Dr. Fields Black's new book, which is called COMBEE. Well, Dr. Fields Black, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much, Will. It's great to be here.
Well, Professor, again, initially, as we mentioned before, when we talk about American history, too often we tend to focus on the founding fathers. And of course, we talk about this political complication, the political parties. But I have to admit that when I started reading your book and regarding Harriet Tubman, the first question I want to ask is, why is it important today? We still need to talk about this person and her contribution to the society or even to the country when we look at the word revolution. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's a great question. Harriet Tubman is best known for her work on the Underground Railroad. And her Civil War service is really the least known chapter of her life. On the Underground Railroad, she made about 13 trips. After liberating herself, she made about 13 trips into slave territory, back to the Maryland Eastern Shore, sometimes back to the plantation where she was enslaved. And she rescued family, friends, and community members, about 70 of them. She also gave instructions for about 70 more people who found their own ways to freedom. Then she went down to coastal South Carolina during the Civil War. I like to call it the belly of the beast. In some ways, it still is the belly of the beast. And, she didn't know these people. She didn't have to take this enormous risk. And the Combahee River Raid is based on her intelligence and piloted by her group of spy scouts and pilots, which she led, and they freed 756 people in 6 hours. It is the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. And Harriet Tubman, Colonel James Montgomery, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, who were 300 black soldiers, the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, which were about 50 white soldiers, and Tubman's group of spy scouts and pilots did it.
Well, again, Professor, just as I was listening to the story, again, when we study American history careful enough, everyone knows Harriet Tubman. I mean, this is not a stranger. But let's go back to what you described. And also, you spend a good amount of time in the book. I want to bring another word into our conversation, which is the word identity. I mean, I think it's important that not only we need to understand who Harriet Tubman was, and also throughout her effort and also her spirit of tenacity, help those people, I mean, again, to completely escape from slavery. According to your research, how would you define the word identity in a sense for Harriet Tubman? I mean, granted, she was a woman and she was alone. Of course, that she had a cohort and she had friends and help her out, but there gonna be something so unique and something so different about this person that identified her characters, even her characteristics that motivated her to push forward. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it had a lot to do with her religion, and her spirituality and her very close relationship with the Holy Spirit. Harriet Tubman was a woman who felt that God spoke to her and God cleared the way for her in the sense that she was completely fearless. There's an old Negro spiritual, maybe it's not that old. Whom shall I fear? Whom shall I fear? She didn't fear anything, and to put herself in danger time and time and time again, to help other people, to risk her freedom, to risk her being re-enslaved, being sold south and separated from her family, her community, to be killed, she risked all of that again and again. And I know, and I think that Tubman's biographers would agree with me. It's because she felt that she had a very close and personal relationship with God. When Tubman was a child, she sustained a very serious brain injury. She was in a store. She was enslaved. She's born and raised enslaved. And she had been sent on an errand to pick things up at a store. And there was another slave in the store whom an overseer was chasing. And the boy came into the store to hide. And Tubman, the overseer arrives and asks Tubman, where is he? She says she doesn't know. And he picks up an iron weight and hurls it in the direction of the boy. And it actually hits Tubman, and it hits her in her forehead, fractured her skull. And for the rest of her life, she had what we know today to be seizures. And she would faint and she would be almost unconscious, for periods of time. And she saw these seizures, these fainting spells, as times when God was speaking to her. And it could happen in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of her being on the road with a group of desperate freedom seekers, traveling at night, and all of a sudden she has a seizure. But she would regain consciousness with revelations about where they needed to go and what they needed to do, or where they shouldn't go. Like, don't go in that direction, go this way. A change in plan that she saw as a divine revelation. So she was an incredibly spiritual woman. And it seems that she did not question God, and so much of what she did, she felt she was empowered to do, she was given to do because of her close relationship with God.
Professor, as I was listening to the story, that it really echoes what we are learning today. Again, from this spiritual or biblical sense, as Christians, we tend to say God is up to something when we are down to nothing. So in other words, we don't really get the chance to ask the questions, but we know that he has a sense of direction and he has the mission for us. Now let's keep on with our conversation. I want to talk about the word freedom. We know that today, when we talk about freedom, it's a rather ambiguous and also intricate concept. It's rather challenging to put actions behind the words in order to interpret the word freedom. But if we look at the concept and also the story in your book, Professor, going back to Harriet Tubman, freedom was the priority. And freedom was something that she was yearning for. And again, not just for her freedom, but it was the freedom in a greater sense. So again, I want to go back to your book. I want to go back to your research. How should we define the word freedom when we look at Harriet Tubman? I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that it was beyond this physical bondage. It was beyond this what we saw just the limitation of the physical body. I think that was more than that. I mean, again, it was just more than what we can comprehend. So I want to hear your thoughts, Professor. How should we define the word freedom, even in the sense of civil war, that she carried this mission? How should we define that? And why was that rather irreplaceable for her and also for the mission that she carried on?
Yeah. I think, as you said, to us today, freedom is very theoretical, right? It's very ambiguous. It's something that we can't nail down. I think for Harriet Tubman, it was actually very concrete, you know, and it was the antithesis of slavery. It was the antithesis of oppression and inequality even. And it's hard to fathom what she was willing to sacrifice for it. And again, not just for herself, because if she were the only person who were free, then that's not really freedom, because then she could be unfree at any moment. To risk her life, you know, again and again and again, so that other people could be free. I think that this was her way. And again, it's not only Harriet Tubman, right? So if we look at the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, if we look at 186,000 Black men who fought during the Civil War, 140,000 of them were formerly enslaved. I think particularly the formerly enslaved men who were willing to go back into the land of bondage to bring people out, who were fighting against slavery. I think for them, freedom was very concrete, right? And they knew that it was not free, that even if they had liberated themselves, until all Black people in the United States of America were free, then freedom really didn't exist. And if you look at something like the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, where you had people who were born free, or people who had freed themselves and they're living in the North or they're living in border states, all of a sudden they can be captured or re-enslaved. All of a sudden, Northern municipalities have to enforce the property rights of Southern slaveholders, right? And so if a Southern slaveholder says, you know, a person with this description ran away and they are my property, then a policeman or a sheriff or whatever in the North is required to enforce it if he shows up, or a slave catcher shows up and says that's his property, right? And so people knew that freedom didn't mean anything until everybody was free, you know, because they could be re-enslaved or enslaved if they in fact were born free. So the fact that they were willing to put their own freedom on the line and their lives. And to many of these formerly enslaved people, Harriet Tubman, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers included, to be re-enslaved would have been a fate worse than death.
Professor, you know, I want to go back to during my undergraduate school when I was a student and I took the class. It's called American History, and also concentration on this American rhetoric. You know, we'll look at the famous, again, historians and also, of course, the political and social figures. But when we talk about Harriet Tubman, that another person came to my mind as I was reading your book, and of course having the conversation with you, was another famous abolitionist is Frederick Douglass. I mean, I remember that he wrote, or correct me if I'm wrong, that he delivered one of the amazing speeches regarding the 4th of July. I mean, something goes as, what is the 4th of July to the slaves? You know, so in other words, why are we actually celebrating this? And really tie into what you just shared about the freedom. I mean, again, Frederick Douglass, he had a specific ideas and a specific concept, and also even actions to motivate people to understand regarding the word of freedom. Now, I want to move on to the next conversation. As I mentioned in the intro, Professor, when we talk about revolution, we tend to focus on people, we tend to focus on the results. But another interesting aspect that you put in the book, I want to be careful, is the word food. And specifically about the rice culture, even the agricultural industry. Professor, can you help us with better understanding what was the rice culture that, as you were researching on this book and look at the life of Harriet Tubman, also all the South Carolina volunteers and stuff, why was that important to put this, I guess what we called the missing piece in this puzzle? How does food play, and how does the rice culture play or fit into the entire picture? Go ahead.
Well, you know that rice is my passion.
I am very glad I hit the nail on the head.
You did. You know, there had not been a lot written about the Combahee Raid before Combee came out. But what I read, particularly in biographies about Harriet Tubman, the biographers tended to say that the Maryland Eastern Shore was the same as the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country. And as someone who had worked in the region for quite a while, I knew this not to be the case. And I like to say, if they are so similar, then why weren't they growing rice in Maryland? And why didn't they grow tobacco in South Carolina? So rice is important because the Combahee River is surrounded by rice plantations. Okay, as far as the eye can see in both directions, it's only rice plantations up and down the Combahee River. And this area, which we call the Ace Basin, today we call it the Ace Basin, the Ashepoo, the Combahee, and the Edisto River, was one of the Confederacy's breadbaskets. So this region and a region north of Charleston produced rice, which fed the Confederate Army, and it fed the Confederate citizens. And the Confederacy was trading it, even though the U.S. Navy had a blockade in the port of Charleston, right? They're still trading it. They're still making money. And that money is helping to finance the war effort. So this is one of the reasons why the region was important. You know, rice was important in so many ways to the story. It was important because I wanted to immerse the reader in the world of the enslaved people. And the labor of these people was exploited growing rice. And rice textures the life in significant ways. You know, first of all, the building of the rice fields and the enormous amount of labor that it took to reclaim the coastal wetlands and to build an irrigation system, and then to maintain it because it has to be fixed, especially when there's storms, etc. The disease environment, right? The fact that rice grows in standing water.
That's right.
And mosquitoes are bred in that water. And these mosquitoes in Africa, as well as in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country, carry malaria. And the malaria made it impossible for white people to live in that region and survive for months out of the year. So this is another reason why I think the Combahee River Raid took place in June, because the white people left in May and they didn't come back until November. And it's a fallacy to think that, people of African descent did not and do not become sick from malaria, but they didn't die in the numbers of the white people. But it also does contribute to extremely high death rates on these rice plantations, because chronic malaria shattered the enslaved people's immune systems and made them vulnerable to all kinds of other ailments, respiratory disease, for example. And so rice was really an important part of the story. And I think the piece de resistance is the fact that I knew from life histories, I knew from testimony of people, enslaved people, about the Combahee Raid, that they had already gone to the rice fields. It was 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning when the gunboats came, depending on where they were on the river. And they were standing in the rice fields hoeing rice when they first heard the uninterrupted pipe of the steam whistles. And so as a writer, I wanted to, again, immerse the reader in that landscape and get the reader to really think about what it would be like to walk a mile from the slave cabins to the rice fields in the dark, where there are snakes, water moccasins, copperheads, rattlesnakes, and then be standing in this water, when you can't see your hand in front of your face, hoeing rice, when you can't see the long-handled hoe in your hands, and you can't see the alligators that are also in the water. Come on now, Will. I had to put the reader there for them to understand what freedom meant to the Combahee people.
Well, Professor, again, you just describe a picture that, I don't know about the viewers, but definitely in my head, all I want to say with all due respect is, I don't want to be there. Because I don't want to be there. Listen to the description of the crocodiles. Listen to the description of the snakes. And especially to understand that I cannot put my hand in front of my eyes and to understand where am I going and whether I'm going to end up being in a good place or not. I mean, this is just terrifying. Now, Professor, two more questions.
I'm going to add one more thing.
Go ahead.
I'm going to add one more thing. Where are my children?
There you go.
Okay? Because children around the age of 10 would have had to work, and they might have been in a field adjacent to their parents, and you can't see your hand in front of your face, and there are alligators in the water. Where are my children, and are they safe?
And it is even heartbreaking just to ask that question. Professor, two more questions before letting you go. Now, I want to ask you another question regarding your research. We know that throughout the journey that you spent, unlimited time and energy to craft this book. So that I do want to remind our viewers one more time to really check out this book because it's well written. There are so many stories that, again, needless to say, I had to stop before I can move on to the next chapter because it's just really grabbing my heart. But I wanted to ask you, Professor, during the research or as you were writing this book, were there any surprises or any wow moments that especially regarding Harriet Tubman? And again, we talk about this person, we talk about her journey, her contribution, her influence. But I want to know if there's gonna be some time that you would take a step back to say, wow, how come the world did not know that? Or how come that for so long when we talk about Harriet Tubman, this is one of the pieces that nobody ever find out. If there any, I would love for you to share with us one, please.
Yes. So I mentioned that Harriet Tubman was the leader of a group of men. And she actually states this in her pension file, that she was the leader of a group, 8 or 9 men who were spies, scouts, and pilots. She recruited the men, she trained the men, she worked in the field with the men. As I was writing, and I mean, this was the 11th hour, this was probably October, November of 2023. So it was time for COMBEE to go to the printer. And I was working on the final revisions, and I had a few documents that I needed to transcribe so that I could quote them and cite them in the work. And one of them, there was 2. One is a letter by Harriet Tubman's nephew, whose name was Harkless Bowley. And in this letter, he describes Harriet Tubman's activities and her leadership during the Combahee Raid. And he says that her group of spies, scouts, and pilots, with them, she found the men who mined the Combahee River with torpedoes. These were enslaved men who were forced to work for the Confederate Army and lay mines on the Combahee River. They found these men, they took them back to the site, and they oversaw them removing and diffusing these torpedoes. Okay. I had a document that I was transcribing, and all of this stuff is handwritten, it's in cursive, and so sometimes it's hard to make out words, and so I always try to get at least another set of eyes, preferably 2, on a document, on a word that not sure I'm getting correctly. So I also had a group of people I consulted with, experts, a few of whom were Civil War history experts, particularly of the Civil War in the Low Country. And this particular expert's name is Stephen Weiss, Dr. Stephen Weiss, Low Country Civil War expert. I said, the document was from the U.S. Army Provost Marshal, and it's describing an enslaved man who had escaped from one of the 7 Combahee rice plantations that was raided, but he escaped a week before the raid. And he brought intelligence to the U.S. Army, and he told them there were torpedoes on the Combahee River, and he described them. And what I was trying to transcribe, and there were a word or 2 I wasn't sure about, was his description of the torpedoes. Now, a lot of Civil War experts had denied that Harriet Tubman had anything to do with the raid. They denied that there were any torpedoes on the Combahee River. They denied this in terms of Tubman because she's not mentioned in the military record. So here I am, it's November 2023, and I've got to get this book out to the printer. And I thought, let me email this document to Stephen Weiss and see if he can help me figure out this word, which is critical to the description of these torpedoes. And he had been skeptical about the torpedoes and about Tubman. Excuse me. He sent me back his transcription and a picture. And his email said, basically, we did it. We did it. We found the smoking gun. I always knew that it was XYZ. So here I had these 2 independent pieces of evidence. Tubman's nephew, and he's probably learning this oral history from Tubman. But then someone who is totally independent of her, another freedom seeker, he arrives a week before, right, the raid, and he's describing the torpedoes. Well, that means that Tubman and her men must have come in that week to remove the torpedoes and then open the river to the U.S. Army boats for the Combahee River Raid.
Wow. Well, Professor, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called COMBEE. Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and the Black Freedom during the Civil War. Now, Professor, we talk so much let's just say for anyone that who are eager to read, who is really eager to read your book, but also had a bit knowledge about Harriet Tubman, what would you expect the readers to appreciate when they finish reading the last chapter of your book? I mean, you cover so much. Again, it's not about someone that we don't know, but it's someone that we know, but perhaps that we don't know her enough. So when we finish reading your book, what would you expect the readers to take away from it? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, my final thoughts are that, you know, many people in the United States, and I think the United States as a country and as a culture, we're still dealing with, or not dealing with, as the case may be, the legacy of slavery. And I think that Tubman and the Combahee River Raid and even the Second South Carolina Volunteers and even the 140,000 men, Black men, formerly enslaved men who fought for the Union are an example of 500,000 formerly enslaved people who liberated themselves during the Civil War and went behind Union lines. And it's the agency of these formerly enslaved people that made the end of slavery inevitable. And I think Tubman is, you know, she's the epitome to have gone back into harm's way, back into the prison house of bondage 13 times to bring 70 people out. And then to go into the belly of the beast in South Carolina and bring out 756 people in the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. I think it's the best example that enslaved people wanted to be free. They would do anything to be free. And it was the agency of the enslaved, not Congress, not President Lincoln, not even the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued and went into effect 6 months before the raid. It's the agency of the enslaved people that brought the end of slavery.
And of course, also, it was the unflinching spirit that motivated, again, a woman
Harriet
and
Tubman.
also all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Fields Black. Again, Dr. Fields Black is a specialist in the transnational history of West African rice farmers, peasant farmers, a pre-colonial Upper Guinea coast, and enslaved laborers on rice plantations in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country during the antebellum period. And again, I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out her amazing book, which is called COMBEE, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and the Black Freedom during the Civil War. Well,
Here's a picture.
there you go. She's holding the book. There you go. Well, Professor, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for your time. We love to have you back on the show for our future episodes as we continue to discuss not only about Harriet Tubman, but also the unknown histories about this wonderful country. So thank you so much for doing this.